I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. The release earlier this month of the Trump administration's new national security strategy vividly captures the tectonic shifts that are occurring in global affairs. For many observers of the international order, it can feel as if there is no framework or structure to the chaotic period in which we are living. If that opinion resonates with you, then today's guest may be able to offer an analytic lens through which to understand our present state of affairs. Professor Michael Beckley published in the November-December 2025 issue of Foreign Affairs magazine a feature article entitled The Stagnant Order. In this thoughtful and deeply researched piece, Professor Beckley argues that the, quote, era of power transitions is ending. For the first time in centuries, no country is rising fast enough to overturn the global balance, end quote. Yet while he argues that the likelihood of a global conflict like last century's world wars is receding, quote, the age of rising powers is ending, but its immediate aftermath may prove no less violent, end quote. Michael Beckley is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University in the United States and a Jean Kirkpatrick visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. His research on great power competition has received numerous scholarly awards, and his work has been featured by a wide variety of leading media outlets. We are very pleased to welcome Professor Michael Beckley to Earlylands in Conversation. Michael, thank you very much for joining us today. Where are we catching you at? I know you divide your time between New York City and DC or Boston. How do you do that?
So I live just outside New York City because my wife has a real job where she has to go to the office every day, whereas I spend most of my time in my pajamas. I have jobs in DC working for think tanks and then up in Boston where I teach at Tufts University. So I guess I'm sort of equidistant between the two main places I work.
Living the reality of the Excella then, right?
I am subsidizing Amtrak as much as I possibly can. Someone's got to. So hopefully I'll
Somebody's
get to
got
ride
to.
on hopefully I'll
Exactly.
get to ride on those fancy new trains at some point. So far, I'm still just
Exactly.
riding the regional.
Exactly. Let's turn to your article, The Stagnant Order, which is in the most recent issue, the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs. And I think it has pride of place in I guess it's a feature, right, for the magazine. And I thought it was just a truly fantastic read. I came away with just a great structure for how to potentially think about the global order that we're in. So your article opens by arguing that for the first time in centuries, quote, no country is rising fast enough to overturn the global balance, end quote. At its core, frame for us your overarching argument in the article. And do you see this framework as something almost close to a theory of history? Not trying to make you a Marxist there, but it's a structural explanation for long cycles of rise, stagnation, and decline.
Well, I was born in Berkeley, California, so maybe I have some lingering
There you
Marxist
go.
tendencies. But yeah, at the highest level, the article argues that the defining engine of modern geopolitics, which has been the rapid rise of a series of new great powers, is now shutting down. Basically, for the past 250 years, it's been what I call an age of ascent, where you had
Right.
countries could turbocharge their growth through rapid industrialization. And then that set off these demographic booms where their populations were doubling in size every generation or two. And then they turned all of that, this manpower and this economic productivity into military scaling. And so you saw the size and the reach and the firepower of militaries increase exponentially. But now I think those pathways are starting to wind down. So you're probably very well aware, your listeners are, that productivity is stagnating across many advanced economies. Populations are shrinking in two-thirds of the countries in the world. Conquest also seems to be becoming harder and less rewarding if you look at Russia trying to take over Ukraine, for example. So instead of this world of that's being constantly reshaped by fast rising challengers, I think we're entering a world of aging incumbents, what I've called a closed club of existing great powers that have waning dynamism, and they're sort of competing over what's left. And whether this is a big macro theory of history, I think it's more of a sort of structural narrative. It's a way of explaining why these eras, why the nature of power shifts over time, and why
Right.
the era of rising powers has emerged and now is fading, and why we may be leaving it behind. It's not deterministic. We have
Hmm.
agency, but it does identify and focus on these deep tectonic forces, the nature of technology, demography, and state capacity that I think shape long arcs of rise and decline.
Right. Well, there's so much there to unpack. But I have to ask, what was it, in your writing life, in your academic life, that caused you to turn to this argument? Was it because of the forces of that you're seeing in geopolitics? Was it sort of lack of an explanation in the academy, in a public discourse? Was it dissatisfaction with what you were seeing from other international affairs specialists? What led you to sort of sit down and put your mind and your pen to paper to come up with this argument?
I think I entered this through the US China power balance. So a lot of my
Right.
early research, my dissertation in graduate school was on the US China power balance, how to measure it, what's driving fluctuations in the balance of power. And while everyone was talking about the Thucydides trap and China's century, I became, after living in China for several years and studying it intensively, I was more struck by what I saw as the emerging slowdown in China's economy, the liabilities that were getting racked up, and basically the unsustainability of the existing growth model in Beijing. And so I wrote a bunch of articles kind of casting doubt on China's continued rapid economic growth and rise. And then I started thinking more broadly and realized that this may be a system wide issue, because when you look at the
Right.
advanced economies, the Western democracies, they're not exactly covering themselves in glory either, with stagnant or negative productivity growth, massive debt, political dysfunction. And then I was very influenced by economic historians such as Robert Gordon at
Mhm.
Northwestern, who have shown just how unique the Industrial Revolution was, how it really took us from a medieval existence to a modern one in less than a century. Like if you were born in the 80s in Britain, you were born into a world of candles and horse carts and using muscle power. And by the end of your lifetime, you could be riding steamships and sending telegraphs and walking down streets electrified that are and houses with indoor plumbing, and just the radical transformation that caused in how we live, and how that might actually be unique, and that as great as things like AI are, they may not be having the same kind of productivity boom that a full scale transformation from the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution had. So I think it's those two combinations, looking at the US China power balance and then generalizing from that, and then being very influenced by some of these economic historians that I
Right.
think have done a fantastic job charting the nature of technology over time.
So do you see yourself aligned with any particular school of thought, that can be maybe casually called a realist or neoconservative or a structuralist, or you say it's not determinist, but or is this approach something distinct, or is that just too easy to search for a category to place your thinking in?
Yeah, I try to avoid any kind of ism attached
Sure.
to me. I mean, I had it drilled into me. I was educated by a bunch of structural realists in my PhD program, but have kind of tried to move above and beyond that, because I now sort of gravitate more towards historians that emphasize the role of contingency and agency, and I just extract whatever is useful from any kind of literature I can get my hands on. I think people will define you more than you can define yourself. So, it remains to be seen
Of
how I
course.
get characterized in the literature. In terms of foreign policy, I think I'm a liberal internationalist at heart, but I'm a realist in terms of the methods used to get to what I hope is a liberal internationalist future. I want to expand and protect the community of liberal democracies in the world, but I think to do that you have to get in the mud and do you have to engage in struggles basically and wield
Right.
power, and sometimes that means you have to compromise. And so it's that constant tension that I think many policymakers grapple with, of they want to get to a good place, but sometimes they have to do nasty things. It's Machiavelli's ideal of doing evil to do good. That's obviously very fraught, can lead to horrible atrocities if you're not careful, but that's how I would classify myself, as a, I guess, a liberal realist, or I don't know, some
Sure.
combination of those two schools
Sure.
of thought.
Yeah. Well, we're recording this on the 24th of November, and the headlines, of course, are about the negotiation towards some sort of ceasefire or end of the war in Ukraine. And so
Mhm.
I'm sure by the time we publish this, who knows where we may be at. But like you say, it's an ugly business of diplomacy, the sausage making, as they say.
Yes.
And it doesn't really fit any buckets or isms. And so I think your turn to historians certainly bears merit. But as you mentioned, you focus, a lot of your work on the rise of China and maybe the plateau of China. And I think you make a very convincing case in the article of that plateau. But when you think of China US competition, military power, and this broader geopolitical forecasting, how did your background, to being an academic and also a professional influencer, so to speak, in terms of the policy world, how did that shape the lens that you apply to this article, where when you talk about structural stagnation rather than more common, just great power competition, right? And I think that looking at it from a structural angle brought something very unique compared to just who has more boats, who has more guns, who has more hypersonic missiles. And what led you to take that approach?
I think, you read a lot of policy magazine articles, and they'll be focused on who's winning the trade war right now. And if someone looks like they caved, they'll announce, "Oh, this was the turning
Right,
point that
right,
China, rose and is going to be dominant from here on out." I just find a lot of those very unsatisfying because if you read history, you realize a lot of these sort of day to day squabbles just fall into the background, and there's these big tectonic forces that
right.
are at play. And so I think because I have the luxury of being a tenure track professor at a university, I can step back. I mean, that's my job. I mean,
Sure,
policymakers do
sure.
not have time to sit there and ponder, the Savafid empire on a daily basis, but I can go do that, and I can go read a bunch of books about it and
Right,
kind of think it over. And so I think that this is why we have such a nice ecosystem of people looking at these things from different levels of analysis. You need the people on the ground doing the day to day, but you also need eggheads sitting in their ivory tower, reading over the millennia of history and trying to look for broader patterns. So I think it's just by dint of where I sit. I don't live in DC. I most of my career is as a career academic. Just caused me to say, where can I add value? I'm not going to be able to tell you the nuances of what the export controls should be tomorrow on China, but I can use this extra time I have to really immerse myself and just see if there's any kind of rhyme or reason to the past, and if anything really sticks out as unique. And that's why I was just so struck that the last 250 years of history seem very unique in the history of geopolitics. And I think we're at a hinge point
right.
right now with a lot of those trends starting to wind down.
So you say in the article that the drivers of the past takeoffs of global powers, whether it be Japan, whether it be Russia or China today, you say that those trends, those demographic booms, industrial breakthroughs, military scaling have all quote unquote closed. Um, how do you why so first of all, just walk us through that argument. Why have they closed? Somebody will obviously say, well, what about AI? Isn't that the great industrial breakthrough? Or military scaling? What about the drone revolution? Autonomous vehicles on the battlefield, that sort of thing. Why won't those have the same impacts that the machine gun or the internal combustion engine has?
It's a great question. And of course, it remains to be seen. But so far, if you look at the productivity statistics, it's just not reflected there. I think the Industrial Revolution so shattered previous ceilings on energy capture, like literally a person's individual energy use multiplied 5 to 10 fold in less than a century. And because you had so much more energy suddenly at your disposal, that led to massive increases in life expectancy, which then caused booming populations and also just enabled us to use these machines that so drastically exponentially increased our strength as a
Right,
species to move stuff around and to communicate across vast distances, that it really shrunk the world in a truly unprecedented way into a single competitive international system, and then propelled the early adopters like Britain, like the United States, like the German states, to
right,
coalesce and form these titanic great powers. And you see it operating first at a regional level. A lot of these great powers that stormed onto the scene were from the agglomeration of essentially super states. So Prussia, for example, industrializes early and just crushes the other German states and forms this German superstate on the international system. The industrial North in the United States
right,
crushes the South and then expands westward and creates this superstate. So, in other words, there was an open map for the early industrializers to go trompsing in and then build really powerful superpowers. and they are propelled by technologies that just were so radically different from what we've seen before. AI today excels in the digital realm. I use it every single day for various
Hmm.
tasks. I think it's going to improve life in many different ways, but it struggles, and where a lot of the economic bottlenecks are in the physical and social realm. So, like, a lot of people point out that AI can pass the bar exam, but obviously lawyers do a lot more. They have to persuade judges and juries and have to do all this kind of critical thinking that is distinct. And I don't think AI can really fully do. Or doctors, it's great to have tablets and automatic
Hmm.
scans that can improve rapidity, but you still need nurses attending to patients. And frankly, because AI is probabilistic reasoning, at least with these large language models, there's going to be error rates. And in just certain areas, whether it's self-driving cars or, if we're looking at for medical for tumors in my body, if
Right.
there's going to be if there's going to be error rates, just given the nature of the technology, I want a human in the loop. And so the translation mechanism from the digital realm to where most of the action is, which is still in the physical and social realms, is kind of herky jerky. Like, a lot of the robots are still quite clumsy because they need batteries and motors, which makes them heavier, which makes them less
Right.
dexterous than even, like a toddler could be. And so maybe 10 years from now, we'll all laugh at how hilariously wrong I was about this coming revolution. But so far, I've been more struck by the limitations of these technologies to be nearly as transformative as what we saw with the Industrial Revolution.
I'm sitting here thinking, if we have this interview in 10 years, will we look back and laugh? But the owners of the great AI companies seem divided, with some thinking that needs to be heavily regulated because of its potential for negative consequences, and then other CEOs who say that there's nothing but blue skies ahead. And so I don't think you're alone in that way. I read this article on a plane when I had an hour or two, and I thought you did, the sort of the magic of transitioning from an academic argument, right, which sometimes is a hard sell, to a wonderful, what is it, 15 or so page article on foreign affairs in which you take very complex issues and distill them down and make a very compelling and convincing argument. Do you think policymakers who have 5 to 10 minutes to maybe digest an intelligence brief, written or verbal, how does this get into the ecosystem, the policy ecosystem? Do you need a policymaker who cares about understanding more than just the immediate?
My sense is it varies a lot depending on the administration. So a lot of folks say, today with President Trump, he likes to operate more on a personal relationship sort of basis. And so if you happen to have a nice dinner with President Trump and can talk to him, you may have his ear and he may be all open to it. But if you're going to write, a 150-page briefing book and have him read it after hours, like, that may not be the most effective way to communicate the
Right.
ideas. I think if you expand, though, beyond just the elected officials to the broader foreign policy bureaucracy, my experience interacting with policymakers has been overwhelmingly positive, and I've actually been heartened by the extent to which I see a variety of perspectives and voices brought in, at least at the level of we're dealing with this issue on a day-to-day basis in the policy world. We don't have the time to sit there and ponder it, to think through all of the ins and outs, but we want to invite a group and we get together. So, like, I regularly meet with members of the intelligence community. I write memos for them, on basically a monthly basis. Roughly every quarter, we get together with other academics and scholars and with all their analysts and kind of game out certain ideas, and they ask us a bunch of questions. And I notice that the people they're inviting, it's a wide range of opinions. So there's people that will disagree with me big time on some of these issues, and they invite all of us there to kind of hash it out. So I detect a demand and a curiosity on behalf of the policymakers. I know sometimes it gets portrayed pejoratively as the blob, the foreign policy establishment. But I think when you actually
Of
interact with
course.
it, you
Right.
realize actually the vast, diverse ecosystem of different opinions and different groups that are making their voices heard. And so, as you called it sausage making, and I think it is kind of like that. It's this chaotic vocal process that goes on, and then somehow it gets distilled into policy. It certainly doesn't lead to great outcomes every single time, but I think the vision that some people try to portray as like this is this myopic, single-minded monster that just moves forward. I think when you actually look at it, I've often been heartened by the extent to which policymakers seek the analysis and advice, and the extent to which they've read foreign
Right.
affairs articles and even academic journal articles because they need this information because they don't have the bandwidth to be able to collect it on a daily basis.
Right. And I think, coming as an intelligence analyst in the background, we were incentivized, or, what we were required to do was to cover the day-to-day issues, right? What does the cabinet reshuffle mean for the United States? We didn't have the time or the bandwidth really to think, in these sort of tectonic thoughts that you were thinking, right? What is truly changing about global society and politics? So I'm very glad to hear that yourself and other scholars are still being asked to do that. So that's certainly heartening. But let's shift a little bit back to China. And again, you can't have any discussion about the stagnant world order and lack of great power, competition, and such, or without discussing China. And you write that China, quote, may be the last power to storm onto the scene, but that has not merely slowed, it is reversing. What, in your view, is the single most decisive factor in China's reversal? I mean, is it demographics? Is it productivity collapse? The political economic model, corruption, property? Tell us what has led you to think that the China model is tapped out, so to speak.
I would say it's the Communist Party.
Right,
We have this story, this fantasy story that China is run by a bunch of thousand-year strategic thinkers, and they brilliantly orchestrated the rise of China. I think there's excellent scholarship that points out that the emergence of the reform and opening movement in China in the 1970s comes after the Cultural Revolution, where the Chinese Communist Party so destroyed itself by purging millions of its members and the military that it actually partially freed the Chinese people from that rigid state
right,
planning and all of the quotas. So the peasants, they didn't want to starve again like they did in the Great Leap Forward. So they formed these quasi-private markets, and whatever they produced above the surplus, they started trading on what are essentially black markets. Sets off this big boom of economic activity. Deng Xiaoping, who has to wage a power struggle just to get out of purgatory and get back to the reins of power, sort of grudgingly approves those through the expansion of these special economic zones. And also the other factor that's working there is the fear of the Soviet Union, which causes China to lean to
right,
the United States and integrate with Western markets. So very different than this Communist Party has a brilliant plan and just asserts it. And so I think a big decisive factor in China's economy is shrinking relative to that of the US. Yes, China is achieved dominance in some mid tier tech industries, but at the cutting edge, the United States still accounts for half of high tech profits. China accounts for like 6%. We can go into all
right,
the weaknesses in the Chinese economy, but in terms of the causes of those weaknesses, I think the most decisive one was the reassertion of the party state through really every level of society and the straitjacket that has put on all of those dynamic factors that were going on in the Chinese economy prior to that. So basically, you have a system where the government has financial repression of the people, so they have to put their money in state-owned banks. That gives
right,
the state a huge low-interest loan, and which is why they can just spend money on whatever, whether it's apartment complexes or solar panels. And at the same time, the state is trying to wall China off from Western influence and markets. So you have this mercantilist policy where subsidies, et cetera, are basically trade barriers. And so, yes, that system, that state level investment driven model could produce a big burst of growth because you're just spending so much money. But now the liabilities have really racked up. You're seeing diminishing returns with
right,
negative productivity growth for more than a decade. That has led to huge excess capacity, obviously, in the real estate sector where already the Chinese people have lost about $18 trillion in household wealth because of apartment complexes that have no value. I think you're just seeing that now in industry where they've churned out so many EVs and solar panels and batteries and can't find markets for them. And so those are going to be wasting assets. Debt surges to over 300% of GDP. And you've ignited international protectionism and conflict because people are so upset that China is subsidizing its manufacturing and then dumping those excess
right.
capacity on international markets. So you add that all up, you throw in the fact that communist systems lead to these personalist dictatorships like we're seeing under Xi Jinping. It would be great if he were some brilliant economic reformer, but he's clearly not. This is the guy who did the zero COVID lockdowns
Right,
among
of
many other
course.
economically disastrous policies. And because China has put so much emphasis on manufacturing and infrastructure, they still lag so much in terms of human capital. Only about 35% of the workforce has a high school degree. The Chinese people are very poor. Disposable incomes are on average about $6,000, which is why consumption in the Chinese economy is so weak. And then the malaise in the Chinese society, which is palpable now, I think
Right.
has contributed to the demographic catastrophe because people have stopped having children. And so all of these are complex ideas, but I think it goes back to communism and to the Communist Party
Sure. So
and to its
structural underpinnings of the state are pretty rotten in terms of kind of how
well,
you would view it.
it's I mean, if you're a one-party dictatorship, you have this tension where on the one hand, you want the dynamism of the free markets and the innovation, but the problem is innovation and creative destruction are really bad for having a monopoly on power. Your industry, who
Indeed.
is rich and who is poor shifts all the time. You get these high-flying entrepreneurs that think they know better and start mouthing off. You get a middle class that demands more of the state, and you may have to share political power. And so you see this constant tension in communist regimes of wanting to open up and get that dynamism, but then having to clamp down again because it starts to threaten what they perceive as their political hold on power. Lenin had his so-called new economic policy where he sort
Right.
of lightened up a little bit and then tightened back down. I think you're seeing something similar with China. We in the West mistakenly thought it was like a linear thing. Like as they start to liberalize economically, it'll just cascade and lead to more liberalization. For them, I think it was always a cyclical thing. It's like we got to open up a bit to capture some of that dynamism,
Right.
but clearly over the last decade or more, they've really been clamping down. And I
Definitely a
think that's the
tightrope, right?
yes,
And
yes.
let's talk about the other, great power that's walking a tightrope, and that would be Russia. And you describe Russia's trajectory as a grim echo of earlier periods of militarization and decay. How does Russia fit into your broader thesis? Is it an outlier because of war and sanctions, or is Russia just simply an early example of the stagnation dynamics that you highlight?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's an outlier. I think it's more of a preview of what we could see
Right.
from China, for example. So I think long before the sanctions and the war in Ukraine, Russia was facing flat or declining productivity, deep demographic shrinkage, a state that had become so heavily dependent on resource rents and facing long-term decline and watching it's remarkable the countries that used to be part of this the former Soviet states like Poland, like the Baltics, the ones that were able to join the West, their growth rates have been 10 times faster than Russia's. Poland is richer than Japan now,
Right.
unbelievably. And so if
Right.
you're Putin and you're looking at that, what you feel used to be part of your empire, and the ones that have fled from you are prospering, and meanwhile, Belarus and others that are stuck with you are stagnating, and your own state is shrinking and stagnating, you basically have two options. You can either preside over the steady decline of your great civilization, or you can use all that military muscle that you've built up to try to snatch things back. And unfortunately, I think the decision to invade Ukraine is this sort of textbook response to not being willing to settle for a steady fall to second rank status, a desperate attempt to try to grab onto territory, resources, and status to try to reset some of these long term power trends. And so, in that sense, Russia shows what this end of rising power dynamic can produce, not just an immediate transfer to a sort of geriatric peace where we all just kind of mellow out, but actually in the short term, more militarization, more risk taking, fewer economic avenues for national renewal. And those get replaced. If you don't have carrots to throw around anymore to buy people off, your natural tendency as a dictator is to start using sticks. So I worry
Right.
that model I worry so much about China going down that same route for broadly similar reasons.
Certainly in the Taiwan case, but maybe let's think about in the US using sticks. How would you think about Venezuela? About what the US and Venezuela right now, this kind of very odd standoff, right? Or this using very, very transparent sticks in terms of how the US is engaged with Venezuela under Trump. Is that the US version of what we are seeing out of Moscow?
Yeah, I see, unfortunately, dynamics in the United States shifting to what I've called a rogue superpower. So, ironically, yes, the US has the same pressures that these other stagnating powers are, although I would say to a far less degree. I mean, that's one of the problems for Russia or China, even China, whose economy may still be growing. The problem is they're not growing to the same extent fully as the United States. They would have to have a much higher growth rate to achieve that. And so even if they were able to keep moving in absolute terms, they could be falling behind in relative terms. So for the US, it's not quite the same dynamic of we're going to fall to second rank status because America's competitors, as bad as the United States is doing, I would not want to be in Russia or China's position instead. So I think it's a different dynamic where, getting tough with countries in the Western Hemisphere, gunboat diplomacy is not some kind of aberration, obviously, in US foreign
Of
policy.
course.
It was quite the norm, especially prior 1945 and, even as late as recent years. And so what I view it more as the United States going back to this sort of rogue superpower angle. I mean, really the last 80 years are the exception in US foreign policy. All these alliances where the US protects other countries and all of their sea lanes, and the US keeps its market open and sponsors free trade and basically tries to create this liberal order. Americans really were not interested in any of that prior to the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. And I think it really took the Cold War to solidify that in terms
Right.
of US foreign policy. And so what we're seeing now is, in the absence of a looming Soviet communist threat that, the Soviets had 175 divisions looming over Europe. They had thousands of nukes. They had this ideology that looked like it was in the ascent, and it was growing rapidly. And communist powers were spreading the fall of China from there on out. And so it caused the Americans to have this more liberal internationalist policy in the absence of something as scary as Soviet communism looming over you. You just have less discipline and you have less need for staunch allies and international norms and institutions and resolving things peacefully. And so the US is just more willing to throw its weight around
Right.
with an aircraft carrier off the shore of Venezuela. I think I'm skeptical. To me, this also just seems like wishful thinking on America's part that we're hoping there's going to be a revolution in
Right.
Venezuela to take down the Maduro regime. And so we just want to show that we will
A
backstop
little
and
bit of
protect.
posturing. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that will protect the revolution. And so
Right.
that hopefully gives them the extra push, the extra confidence they need to do it. But I'm not so sure, talking to some of my friends who are experts on Latin America, that there was a solid revolution bubbling up in Venezuela to really try to fan the flames of. So to me, it seems like a potential miscalculation
Right.
on
Right.
on America's part, but we'll have to see how it plays out.
We have a lot of our listeners are in Africa and have a strong interest in the continent. And you write that a third of African states are in active conflict, and that youth unemployment tops 60% in parts of the Middle East and the Sahel. How central is the crisis of fragility in the developing world to your overall argument? More broadly, how should we think about Africa and it being a very youthful continent with great potential, but also huge headwinds? How should we think about
From a demographic perspective, the future is African. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa is going to add a billion people between now and 2050. So
that?
it's
Exactly.
a demographic shift unlike anything we've seen in human history. I think the broader fragility in the developing world is central to the argument we're talking about here, because the developing world is where these contradictions of our modern yet stagnating age show up most violently. Because a lot of countries, for example, in sub Saharan Africa, have achieved some of the health and longevity gains of modernity. They have higher, their life expectancy has gone way up. You
Right.
still have high, relatively high, but still lower infant mortality than what it was before. But the problem is they don't have the industrial base to absorb the big boom in youth cohorts. So you have this huge youth bulge bubbling up in, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And I fear that demography can be a boon or a devastating liability depending on the broader system you have to integrate young people into your workforce and society. I worry in a place like sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to see broadly a demographic trap where you have fast population growth paired with stagnant or shrinking economies. I mean, right now in sub-Saharan Africa, only about 11% of workers
Right.
are in industry. That's basically the same from what it was decades ago. More, as you mentioned, more than a third of states are now in active conflict, because I think there's just a lot of young people, and especially young dudes, who are just uneducated and are basically
Absolutely.
falling into these gangs and jihadist groups
It
because
makes me
that's
think of a colleague of mine back in the CIA, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, in the midst of the horribleness of the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And he made an off the cuff quip, but it was so true that he viewed the most dangerous thing in the world is a bored 18-year-old man. and which sort of drove so much of what you saw in Sierra Leone's conflict, for example. But I think that could be applied pretty much anywhere where you have 18-year-olds without any real economic future.
Having once been a bored 18-year-old man, I
Indeed.
can attest to the fact that we tend to get up to no good if
Yeah,
not redirected by some other force. And I think the problem in Africa is they're also, because they're industrializing late, you
right.
may have some manufacturing industries, but they're way more automated than they were when, say, the East Asian
Right.
countries in the
Right.
70s and 80s were having labor intensive manufacturing, or when China was rising. They're much more commodified. They also tend to be just one little node of some multinational corporations' longer supply chain. And so they're not building fully vertically integrated industries where you have all different parts of the industry and then can develop local industries of your own to compete on world
Right.
markets. You are just some cog in a broader, frankly, Western dominated and increasingly China orchestrated supply chain. And so it just doesn't lead to the kind of sustainable development we saw, for example, in the East Asian tigers.
Exactly.
And it doesn't provide nearly the same employment opportunities for the broader population. So I just worry that ladder that so many past rising powers use to climb up those value chains has been pulled up, and that especially sub-Saharan Africa, which already, I mean, there's lots of other reasons why that has been a poor region. The climate is very difficult, water scarcity, it's hard to grow crops. There's a higher disease burden because of the tropical climate in some areas, or it's arid and landlocked. I mean, it's just those same factors still apply, but then you throw on top just the evolution of the global economy, their
Indeed.
position in that global economy, and now having to deal with these booms that have been set off by partial industrialization, but not really being able to put the whole package together.
It leads me to be very worried about those youthful energies can be easily marshaled into a rebel movement or into, something that is obviously a detriment to the states.
I think the only way it happens is if you have a highly globalized system. Because, like, theoretically, Europe, the United States, Japan, these advanced economies, they have either stagnant or shrinking populations. And so
Right.
they need labor.
Right.
And you could see a symbiosis where you have these booming populations in developing countries, but they're capital poor. But then you have these capital rich nations, but are labor poor. And you could have a lot of cross border transactions and cooperation. But that obviously is very fraught. I mean, we're seeing with the
Of course.
immigration issue, with the backlash against free trade and investment. That's such a thorny political battle. And that's why, even though I think there's a potential optimistic future, I tend to err on the side of being more guarded and
Right.
pessimistic, because I just see these challenges being very difficult to surmount.
Well, that's a nice way to transition to talking about the future. And you had mentioned earlier, I think it was the phrase was geriatric peace. And in the final pages of the article, you note that there are potential silver linings to this dynamic that you've described, healthier societies, slower, more sustainable growth, and, possible new models of economic organization. But what gives you optimism that this stagnant order, which maybe, will miss a next great world war that would have been launched in the past by a rising power like Japan or Nazi Germany. But what gives you optimism about this stagnant order could lead to stability or even potentially renewal?
It's sort of the flip side. So rising powers are great because they're global growth engines. So, for example,
Right.
the rise of China was generating about 40% of global economic growth, just creating demand for so many products that so many different countries produced. And so it became a gravy train for everyone to attach themselves to. That's wonderful. But they also tend to shake up the world because they want their place in the sun. They start translating some of that wealth into military power. And especially their leaders just get these sky high ambitions. And so, while the downside, obviously, to not having a world of rising powers is maybe slower growth, the potential upside is less geopolitical upheaval because you
Right.
just don't have the next one coming along to really shake up the world. I think that might also apply potentially at the domestic sphere. I mean, the 20th century was both the biggest boom in prosperity, but also the most catastrophic from just a death and destruction perspective.
Right.
Obviously, the world wars, but also a lot of the revolutions that took place. When you have huge youth populations, they are confronted with radically new technologies that are overturning industries. They tend to start thinking about broader ideological
Right.
explanations. And that's how you get fascism or communism or any of these other isms that really try to remake humanity from the bottom up in some kind of utopian political religion. I think in a more static or stagnant age, people are going to be less beholden to those kind of religions to throw themselves behind. And so hopefully that means less conflict and chaos. As you mentioned, You throw in the geriatric piece. I mean, when the great powers stormed into World War One, the median age in them was like 21, a bunch of
Right.
21-year-olds.
Right.
Today, in all the great powers, it's over 40, and in about a decade, it's going to be in the 50s for a lot of these great powers. And so maybe we'll just be wiser and too weary to go storming off into another world war. I think even with slower growth, there's also a positive story to tell about still rising living standards. Like right now,
Right.
the human race is healthier, better educated, and I think we're benefiting from these incremental but still real technological improvements in so many, the digital age, the AI, the changes in biotechnology. I think all of those are going to be wonderful, even if they don't set off yet another sort of economic revolution. And then the last thing that we talked about, this mismatch between aging rich countries with declining populations and youthful poor countries, could create this new global division of labor that sustains prosperity. And at the same time, with shrinking populations in the rich world, I mean, you've seen with something like climate change, people saying, hey, actually, maybe, we may have to revise some of our projections of the warming planet because it turns out the populations are shrinking faster than we thought,
Right.
which means we're having lower growth and emissions. And so that makes something like climate change easier to tackle, just because you don't have constantly booming populations that you're having to care for and find ways to clean up after.
Well, Mike, I mean, there's so much to discuss there, but that's a great way to wrap up with a question that I always ask every guest is for them to name 1 to 2 books that will help our listeners if they want to go further on this. And we've touched about pretty much every subject here: political, social, economic, military, you name it. What you've done, I think, is scratched an itch for people who are looking for broader lenses or frameworks in which to understand this very chaotic and disconcerting world. If you had to put a couple books on the nightstand to help our listeners think about the world in which we live, what would you recommend?
Oh, geez. So many. So
Yeah, exactly.
one that I've just gone back to, it's kind of like the well I've gone back to over and over again, is Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of
Of
Great Powers,
course.
because I think he's just so good at describing not just the big picture, but also a lot of the nuances of this, what I view as a unique period in history. So it really helped me grapple with the age of ascent that we've seen over
Right.
the last
And such a
250.
wonderful writer, too.
Wonderful writer and a really a wonderful man. I had the honor of meeting him a few years
Great.
ago and was just a great guy. Robert Gordon, who I mentioned earlier, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, or even just some of the articles he's written off of that, he really made me think heavily about how radical is our technological innovation pace and
Right.
revolution right now compared to that of the Industrial Revolution. I think read anything by Ian Morris, who's a professor at Stanford. He wrote his most famous book is probably called "Is Why the West Rules for Now." He's a classicist and an archaeologist who also writes about history, and he goes back 15,000 years and looks at changes in energy capture and social systems and how that has led to the rise and fall of great civilizations over time. And then if you're looking for the more academic treatment of this, there's a book called The Global Transformation by a scholar named Barry Buzan, where he goes through the sort of the history and the theory and what he calls the making of modern international relations. So it hits a lot of these same themes, but gives you the kind of theoretical and philosophical and scholarly treatment of a lot of what we've been talking about today.
Oh, fantastic. Well, my wife will be mad at you because you've just added yet 2 more books that will be arriving fairly soon that I wasn't familiar with. But
I
those
love
are
it.
great recommendations, and we will put those into the show notes as well. Professor Michael Beckley's article, The Stagnant Order, is the feature story in Foreign Affairs November-December 2025 issue. And as you can tell from this discussion, it is well worth 30 to 45 minutes of your time. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Todd. It's really a pleasure.